Think for a second about the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
There is this fundamental biological reflex that is just, built right into your body. If you accidentally brush your hand against a hot stove, your arm recoils before your conscious brain even registers the sensation of heat.
Right, it is totally involuntary.
Yeah, the sensory neurons fire, the signal hits your spinal cord, and the reflex arc just pulls your hand away instantly. It is a completely hardwired biological mechanism. You are designed literally at a cellular level to preserve your physical existence.
Which makes sense. I mean, physical preservation is basically the loudest, most aggressive instinct any of us possess.
Absolutely. And we build our entire modern societies around that specific instinct. I mean,
Hmm.
we buy vehicles with pre-collision braking systems. We track our sleep cycles and our heart rates on our wrists.
Yeah, we buy insurance policies to cover the deductibles on our other insurance policies.
Spot on. We live in gated communities. We filter our drinking water. The preservation of physical life is just, well, the unquestioned baseline of human existence.
It is the absolute baseline of our biology and our sociology. The desire to survive, to mitigate risk, and to avoid pain that drives almost every economic and personal decision we make. We want to stay alive, and we want to be comfortable while doing it.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, our mission in this deep dive is to examine a collection of theological texts that look directly at that biological imperative, that fundamental flinch, and ask you to override it.
Which is a heavy thing to ask.
It really is. We are looking at a staggering question presented in our sources today. The question is God better than physical life itself?
Wow.
Right. We are going to map out the stark difference between what the material calls a wasted life, which is a life consumed by the frantic anxiety of self-preservation, and an unwasted life, which is a life consumed entirely by the supreme value of Christ.
We are putting some highly disruptive texts on the table today, honestly. We are going to look at King David's desperate cry from the Judean desert in Psalm 63. Yeah, and then we will look at the direct, uncompromising commands of Christ from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. And finally, we will look at the Apostle Paul's shocking accounting ledger in Philippians 3.
That one is pretty intense.
It is. Together, these texts challenge the comfortable peacetime mentality that dominates so much of modern Western Christianity. They call for a radical wartime mindset, like a complete reevaluation of what constitutes actual safety.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, as we set this up. You live in a culture obsessed with safety and longevity. The concepts we are discussing today will probably sound entirely countercultural to you.
Oh, they definitely will.
They go against the grain of the American dream, and they go against your own biological flinch. But the stakes are eternal. We begin our examination where the concept of God's steadfast love is put to the most violent test imaginable. We are going to the desert.
Into the wilderness.
Yeah, let's step out of the comfort of climate-controlled modern life and step into the brutal reality of David's historical situation in the wilderness of Judah.
The historical and geographic setting is so vital for understanding what is happening in this text. Psalm 63 is not some piece of detached wisdom spoken from a comfortable armchair,
Right, or an air-conditioned lecture hall.
Yeah, this is worship in the dust. The superscription of the psalm tells us it was written when David was in the wilderness of Judah. Historically, the sources connect this specific period to his flight from his own son, Absalom.
Which is just a brutal family dynamic.
Totally. Think about the political and emotional devastation of that exact moment. David is the anointed king of Israel, but his own flesh and blood has orchestrated a massive, successful coup. The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom.
And David is forced out.
Yeah, David is betrayed, driven out of his own capital city of Jerusalem weeping, and forced into one of the most inhospitable climates on the face of the earth.
I want to make that scenario visceral for a second, because we hear the word wilderness, and our modern minds immediately picture like a state park or a rugged weekend camping trip.
Yeah, with a cooler full of snacks.
Right, exactly. Let's translate this into modern terms. Imagine picking up your phone right now, opening your banking app, and seeing a zero balance. Your life savings are just gone.
Terrifying.
Not only that, but your reputation has been destroyed globally overnight. People are actively hunting you. You have been forced to flee your home with only the clothes on your back. Your physical safety is completely gone. And the person who orchestrated this total destruction of your life is your own child.
It is almost unimaginable.
You are quite literally in a dry, weary land with no water. That is David's reality. And yet when you read his words in this moment of total collapse, His primary thirst is not for a cup of water, and his primary request is not for a military victory. His primary thirst is for God.
To grasp the gravity of that reaction, you really have to understand the geography of the Judean wilderness. It stretches eastward from the hill country down toward the Dead Sea. It is jagged, exposed, relentlessly hot, and just completely devoid of comfort.
Not a place you want to be stranded.
No, it is a terrifying place to be without a supply train. Plus, you have to understand the theology of the ancient Near East at that time. In that era, the geopolitical and religious assumption across all the surrounding nations was very simple. Deities were territorial.
Right.
If a king was driven off his throne and into exile, it meant his god had abandoned him or had been defeated by a stronger god. If you lost your land, well, you lost your deity's favor.
Your God was proven weak. The gods of the opposing army were proven strong. That was just the math of the ancient world.
That was the unquestioned consensus. So when David expresses this ecstatic joy in Yahweh while sitting in the dirt, starving and deposed, he completely shatters that pagan assumption.
He flips it upside down.
He does. He is demonstrating to his loyal followers who fled with him, and to us reading it thousands of years later, that his security was never anchored in the stone walls of Jerusalem. His joy was never tethered to the physical crown on his head.
It was anchored in the unshakable character of God. The physical barrenness of the wilderness basically becomes an earthly mirror of his internal spiritual longing.
Yeah.
I have to push back here, though, or at least ask the question that naturally arises for anyone listening. Is it realistic to expect a normal human being, someone facing literal starvation, severe medical distress, or absolute financial ruin, to prioritize spiritual communion over physical relief?
It sounds extreme.
It really does. Telling someone who is literally dying of thirst in a desert to focus on God rather than water sounds almost cruel. It sounds like religious mania. How does this actually work in a normal human brain?
Well, it is a necessary question, and it brings us to a really vital distinction in the text. David does not dismiss his physical needs. He is not practicing some form of stoic detachment where he pretends his body does not matter, or that the heat of the sun is an illusion, or that water is unnecessary.
Okay, so he's not in denial.
Right. He recognizes the very real value of physical life, but he rightly orders his needs. He refuses to call those physical needs the main thing.
So he is creating a hierarchy of the soul.
Precisely. He recognizes that a crown without God brings total misery, while a desert with God brings true satisfaction. He reorders human need. He proves that your physical circumstances do not dictate the state of your soul.
Wow.
Yeah, a person can be physically depleted, standing on the edge of death, and yet be spiritually feasting. The question David forces the reader to ask is not, how do I escape this hardship as quickly as possible? The question is, do I possess and desire the Lord in the middle of this hardship?
That leads us to the specific grammar of desperation and praise that David uses here. We are moving from the harsh environment of the desert to the actual theological framework he constructs to survive it. Look at verse 3 of the psalm, because your steadfast love is better than life.
That is a massive statement.
It is. It is so easy for modern people to treat God like a cosmic insurance agent. We keep him around to guarantee a peaceful retirement or to make sure our physical health stays intact or, to protect our children from accidents.
A safety net.
Exactly, just a safety net. But David makes a mathematical calculation here that tips the scales entirely toward God, regardless of the physical outcome. He looks at his own pulse, his own breathing, his own physical existence, and says, God is better.
The original Hebrew text is just thrilling when you look at the mechanics of what David is actually saying.
Yeah.
The phrase translated as steadfast love is the Hebrew word hesed.
Hesed.
Yes, and this is not a fleeting emotional sentiment or some romantic feeling. Hesed refers to God's covenant loyalty, his sworn mercy. It is love backed by an eternal decree.
Okay, so it has legal weight.
Huge legal weight. In the ancient world, covenants were blood oaths. They were legally binding, life or death agreements. When David speaks of God's hesed, he is speaking of an ironclad promise from the creator of the universe.
A promise that cannot be broken no matter how bad the circumstances get.
Yeah. And David compares this hesed to life. The Hebrew word for life here is chaim. It is a plural noun, literally meaning lives. It encompasses all possible forms of physical vitality, prosperity, longevity, and comfort.
All the things we chase.
All of them. And David attaches the comparative preposition min to it, which translates as than. So the calculation David makes in the dust of the desert is this. Even if you multiplied every conceivable earthly success, every physical pleasure, every moment of perfect health, and every comfort across 1,000 lifetimes, Yahweh's his outweighs them all combined.
That is a staggering calculation. It makes our modern obsession with extending our lifespans by a few years or hoarding comforts for retirement look incredibly small.
It really shrinks our earthly priorities.
But there is a tension in this text that I want to bring up. In verses 7 and 8, David says his soul clings to God, yet he also says God's right hand upholds him. How does a person balance that?
That is the big question.
Right, because how do you balance the frantic, active clinging of your own soul with the quiet resting in the fact that God is upholding you? Clinging implies desperate effort, while being upheld implies resting in someone else's strength.
That tension is basically the heartbeat of the historic Reformed view of providence and grace. The historic confessions of faith teach that God upholds, directs, and governs all creatures and all actions. But the believer is still commanded to cling fiercely to God.
So we still have to put in effort.
Yes, we are not called to be passive participants in our faith. We seek, we praise, we remember, we hold on for dear life. But, and this is the structural bedrock of the theology here, we do not boast in our grip.
Because our grip is weak. Think about a toddler holding a parent's hand while walking along the edge of a steep cliff.
Okay, good visual.
The toddler might be gripping the parent's fingers as hard as they possibly can, right? They are putting all their effort into holding on. But if they trip, that tiny grip will fail instantly. The only reason the toddler is safe is because the parent's massive hand is completely wrapped around the child's hand.
Right.
The toddler is clinging, but the parent is upholding.
That is a brilliant illustration of the theological reality. Our grip trembles, our hands get tired, our faith wavers. If our salvation or, our survival in the wilderness depended on the strength and consistency of our own clinging, we would all be lost.
Totally lost.
The believer's grip is sustained entirely by the sovereign, upholding hand of God. Your human action is real, your clinging is genuine, but divine preservation is the bedrock underneath it all. We persevere only because God preserves us. That doctrine is what allows a believer to risk everything because they know they are held by a hand stronger than death.
We are going to move forward in the biblical timeline now, jumping from David in the Old Testament wilderness to the New Testament, where Jesus addresses a very different kind of wilderness.
A more common one, perhaps?
Yeah, it is not the literal desert of Judah, but the daily grind of agrarian poverty under Roman occupation. We're looking at Matthew chapter 6, a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus commands his followers quite bluntly not to worry about what they will eat, what they will drink, or what they will wear.
Which is easier said than done.
Exactly. I'm going to play devil's advocate here again. These listeners were Galilean peasants. They were day laborers and subsistence farmers. They were taxed by Rome, taxed by Herod, and taxed by the temple.
They're squeezed from every side.
They legitimately did not know where their next meal was coming from. Telling them not to worry sounds a lot like telling a drowning person to just relax and enjoy the water.
If we view Jesus as just a moral philosopher handing out detached lifestyle advice, it does sound absurd and pretty insensitive, honestly. But we have to look at the linguistic mechanics of what Jesus is actually saying here in the Greek text.
Okay, let's break it down.
He diagnoses what we might call the pagan panic. He says that the Gentiles, the surrounding nations, eagerly seek these material things. The Greek verb used is epizetousin.
Epizetousin.
Right. The prefix epiar intensifies the verb. It means they pursue material security with an exhaustive, frantic, consuming obsession. They're literally driven by a terror of tomorrow.
It is not just a casual desire to have a good meal, then. It is an absolute panic about survival that controls their every waking thought.
Yes. And Jesus contrasts that pagan panic with a continuous command for his disciples, zetai proton. Seek first the kingdom of God.
Seek first.
The grammar demands that the search for God's sovereign rule must be the primary filter through which all other actions, decisions, and anxieties are evaluated. Jesus is telling people living under massive socioeconomic pressure to operate on a completely different spiritual plane. He is telling them to reject the fundamental biological flinch of self-preservation.
But how can he demand that? Like, what is the guarantee that they will not just starve to death while seeking the kingdom? If you stop worrying about your crops and start focusing on God's rule, what stops you from dying of exposure?
The guarantee is found in the promise Jesus attaches to the command, all these things shall be added to you. The Greek verb used there is prosthethesetai.
Okay.
It is in the passive voice, specifically what scholars call the divine passive. It indicates that God himself is the active agent who will supply the need.
So God is the one doing the adding. The believer does the seeking of the kingdom, and God takes the responsibility for adding the food and clothing.
He does. And this brings us to a harsh truth about how we live today. To live in a state of frantic self-preservation, constantly obsessed with our physical and financial security, is practical atheism.
Practical atheism. That is a heavy accusation for someone who might be sitting in a church pew every Sunday. Let's look closely at what that term actually means. How does checking your bank account or worrying about inflation equate to atheism?
It means you might profess a belief in God with your mouth on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, your bank account, your anxiety levels, and your lifestyle publicly declare that the Father's sovereign care is insufficient.
Wow, that hits hard.
You live as if God does not exist, or at least as if he's entirely incapable of providing for you. When you lie awake at night consumed with panic about the future, your body and your mind are acting out a theology that says you are alone in the universe and must secure your own survival. It is high treason against the providence of God.
If we look at the landscape of modern religion, we see two massive errors that people fall into regarding this concept. On one side, you have the error of treating God as a mechanism for earthly increase.
The prosperity model.
Yes, prosperity theology. It treats God like a slot machine. You put in your faith, you pull the lever, and you expect cash and perfect health to come out. It values the gifts infinitely more than the giver.
It is a complete distortion.
And then on the other side, you have the error of legalistic asceticism, where people try to earn God's favor by making themselves miserable. They think that suffering inherently produces holiness and that God is pleased by their self-inflicted poverty.
Also a distortion.
Right. So the biblical path cuts right through the middle of those two disastrous errors. The biblical path is radical reliance. It is trusting the divine passive we just talked about, letting God do the adding while we do the seeking, without treating God as a tool for wealth or treating poverty as a savior.
That sums up the kingdom ethic perfectly. The teaching of Jesus does not say wealth is inherently evil, nor does it say wealth is a sign of divine approval. It says that whatever material resources you have, they are entirely subordinated to the kingdom. They're tools, not treasures.
But if Jesus is guaranteeing provision for peasants, what happens when you already have money? Does the anxiety actually go away, or does it just change shape?
It usually just changes shape.
Right. If material worry is a trap for the poor and the vulnerable in Galilee, what about the highly successful? What about the people who have already climbed the social ladder and secured the bag? That brings us to the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 3. Here's a man who possessed elite social, educational, and religious capital.
Paul had the ultimate first-century Jewish resume. He tells us he was of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee.
So he was the best of the best.
He had a flawless genealogical pedigree. He was educated under Gamaliel, the premier theologian of his day. He possessed immense social and religious standing. In modern terms, he was the equivalent of an Ivy League-educated prodigy with massive political influence and unblemished moral standing.
He had it all.
He had everything a person in his culture could possibly want to ensure his safety, his status, and his legacy.
And what does he do with it? He looks at that entire pristine resume, the very things that society tells us to build our identities around, and he throws it directly in the trash.
Literally tosses it.
I want you to picture this scenario. Imagine walking into a high-end commercial bank to pay off $1 million mortgage. But instead of handing the teller a cashier's check or a briefcase full of cash, you drag a leaky, foul-smelling bag of raw garbage into the lobby and heave it onto the marble counter.
They would be horrified.
The bank teller would not just decline your payment. They would be completely repulsed. They would call security to have you forcibly removed from the building. That is precisely how Paul views his own human merit when it comes to paying off his debt to a holy God.
That visceral, offensive image is incredibly close to the original Greek text. Paul is using a bookkeeping metaphor in Philippians 3. He looks at his earthly gains, everything he achieved through his intellect and his discipline, and he does not just count them as zero.
He doesn't just say they are neutral.
No, he counts them as a severe deficit. The specific, shocking word Paul uses to describe his past gains is skubala.
Subala.
Yes, and it is a jarring, offensive word. Paul had milder vocabulary options available to him. He could have used the word copria, which means standard manure used constructively for fertilizer.
Okay, so a softer word.
Right, or he could have used paripsima, which means the dirt or dust you wipe off your shoes.
Yeah.
But he deliberately chose skubala. In the Greco-Roman world, this word referred to putrid refuse, human excrement, or the rotting table scraps that were thrown into the street for wild dogs to eat.
Why would a highly educated Pharisee, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, use such a graphic, repulsive word to describe his own moral achievements, his own law-keeping, and his own religious pedigree?
Because of the massive theological weight of justification by faith alone, Paul does not view his human merit, his strict rule-keeping, and his religious achievements as simply suboptimal or insufficient. He views them as spiritually toxic.
Toxic.
Yes. If you try to bring your own performance, your own goodness, your own charitable giving, or your own elite status to the finished work of Christ, you pollute the gospel. You bring a bag of rotting garbage into the throne room and placing it on the altar next to the blood of the Son of God.
Adding any human performance to Christ's work ruins the equation. It implies that Christ's death was not entirely sufficient.
Entirely. To gain Christ, a person must stand before the judgment seat of God stripped of all self-reliance. You have to look at your finest accomplishments, the things you are most proud of, the things you put on your resume, and classify them as absolute refuse, so that you can be clothed exclusively in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Bringing your own merit to the cross is an insult to the cross.
Let's step back and look at the landscape we have covered so far. We have looked at David clinging to God in the literal desert, proving that covenant loyalty is better than water.
Right.
We have looked at the Galilean peasants being commanded to trust God for their daily bread, rejecting the pagan panic. And we have looked at Paul throwing his elite status in the garbage, calling his best achievements putrid refuse. But how is any of this actually possible for flawed humans?
There's a high bar.
Because going back to our opening discussion about the autonomic nervous system, our natural instinct is self-preservation. We want to cling to our physical lives, we want to hoard our bread, and we want to boast about our resumes.
It is hardwired into us.
We cannot just look at David or Paul as spiritual superheroes and try to mimic them. If we just try harder to be like Paul, we fall right back into the trap of human performance and legalism. We need a substitute.
And that necessity leads us to the focal point of all these texts. Everything we have discussed points directly to the one who perfectly embodied this valuation of God. Jesus Christ is the true David.
Okay, unpack that.
Think about the parallels.
Yeah.
Jesus was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. He faced Satan face to face. And when Satan tempted him to turn stones into bread to save his own physical life, to satisfy his agonizing hunger, Jesus refused.
He proved, under the most extreme physical duress imaginable, that the Father's word is better than physical sustenance.
Contrast that with the history of humanity. The first Adam was placed in a lush, perfectly irrigated garden. He had every physical need met, he had zero threats to his survival, and yet he still grasped for autonomy, rebelled against God's word, and lost his life in the process.
He had everything and still failed.
Exactly. Later, the nation Israel was in the wilderness, saw miraculous provision of manna from the sky, and still grumbled against God in pagan panic. But Christ, the greater David and the true Israel, was in the barren wasteland, starving to the point of death, and triumphed through perfect obedience. He demonstrated that the Father's glory is infinitely more precious than bread, power, or physical life.
And that obedience in the Judean wilderness culminates in the ultimate desert experience, which is the cross. Take us to Calvary. How does the crucifixion answer the cries of Psalm 63 and the demands of Matthew 6?
When Jesus was hanging on the cross, he cried out, "I thirst." In that moment, he was experiencing the ultimate manifestation of a dry and weary land where no water is. He was cut off from the visible sanctuary of the Father's presence.
Total isolation.
The sky went dark. He was bearing the unmitigated holy wrath of God against our idolatry, our practical atheism, and our frantic self-preservation. Yet, even in the middle of that cosmic drought, experiencing the full terror of divine judgment, he perfectly executed the command to seek the kingdom first. He willingly yielded his physical life to secure the eternal covenant for his people.
So when David says in the psalm, "Your steadfast love is better than life," he is writing a theological truth. But Jesus is the one who actually lives that out to the absolute terrifying limit. He proves it by bleeding to death.
He does. And this is where the doctrine of imputed righteousness becomes our only hope. Christ's obedience has two distinct facets that benefit the believer. First, his active obedience.
Right.
During his entire earthly life, he lived a life of perfect reliance on the Father. He never once succumbed to pagan panic. He never worried about tomorrow. He perfectly kept the law in thought, word, and deed.
That is the active part.
Yes. And second, his passive obedience. He willingly submitted to the penalty of death, allowing himself to be crucified, bearing the curse of the broken law in our place.
He lived the perfect life we continually fail to live, and he died the agonizing death we deserve to die. Think about a high school student who fails every single test in a class. They have an absolute 0 in the gradebook.
Hopeless situation.
Completely. The valedictorian of the school, who has a perfect 100%, goes to the teacher and swaps names on the final ledger. The failing student gets the valedictorian's perfect grade, and the valedictorian takes the failing student's 0 and accepts the expulsion. That is imputation.
That is precisely the mechanism of grace. Because of Christ's active and passive obedience, his perfect record is credited or imputed to the believer. Christ purchased an everlasting inheritance for his people, and the practical daily result of that transaction is staggering because your eternal destiny is totally secure, signed in the blood of the Son of God. You are completely freed from the frantic necessity of preserving your physical life at all costs. You do not have to panic anymore. You are safe, eternally.
We have established the theological reality. Now we have to bring the application directly to your daily life, the listener. We need to contrast this biblical mandate of a wartime lifestyle with our modern Western habits.
This is where it gets uncomfortable.
Yeah, I want to bring up a devastating statistic from the sociological data in our sources. The average person today consumes over 7 hours of digital media a day. 7 hours of staring at glowing rectangles.
Yeah, that is a staggering number. It is a quiet, comfortable tragedy happening in living rooms across the world.
It really is. The sources refer to this phenomenon as the digital altar. We are sacrificing our time, our attention, and the neuroplasticity of our minds on this altar. Our attention spans are being systematically dismantled by endless scrolling.
Just feeding the algorithms.
Yes, we are consuming trivial entertainment and artificial outrage generated by algorithms designed to keep our eyes glued to the screen. And the spiritual result is that the weight and the glory of God seem light, peripheral, and boring to us. We complain that we cannot sit in silence for 5 minutes to pray or meditate on the creator of the universe without our minds wandering, but we can binge watch 6 hours of a streaming television show without blinking.
To illustrate how far the modern church has fallen from the biblical standard of a wartime mindset, the text introduces a historical analogy regarding the Queen Mary ocean liner during World War II.
I want to spend some time on this analogy because it perfectly captures the shift in mentality we are talking about. Describe the Queen Mary in its original state.
In peacetime, the Queen Mary was the absolute height of transatlantic luxury. It was a magnificent floating palace. The dining rooms were extraordinary. Passengers were served meals with 15 different plates and glasses per setting.
15!
There were orchestras playing, grand staircases, and the staterooms featured spacious, comfortable double bunks. The entire architecture and operation of the ship were designed exclusively for comfort, leisure, and the indulgence of its passengers.
A literal luxury liner.
But when World War II broke out, the global situation changed overnight. The ship was drafted into military service. The wartime refit was drastic and violent. They ripped out the elegant dining tables and replaced them with stark metal trays. They tore out the spacious beds, removed the luxurious furniture, and stacked canvas bunks 8 tiers high.
Just completely gutted it.
They painted the exterior a dull camouflage gray. Why? So they could transport 15,000 combat troops at a time across the Atlantic. The luxury was completely stripped away, replaced by lethal utility.
The ship had the exact same steel hull. It had the exact same massive engines propelling it through the water, but it had an entirely different mission. It went from being a playground to being a weapon.
And the application to the Christian life is direct. The church is supposed to be operating on a wartime footing. Our personal budgets, our family schedules, our homes, our bank accounts, they are supposed to be weapons for the kingdom, deployed to advance the gospel and relieve suffering.
Not just comfort items.
No, they are not supposed to be toys for our personal luxury. But so many believers are living their lives on a peacetime luxury liner, complaining about the temperature of the soup, while a global spiritual war is raging just outside the porthole.
To drive that point home about the reality of war and the nature of sacrifice, I want to share a historical account mentioned in the text that just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
Think about the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima in early 1945. Colonel Johnson's battalion landed on that island with 1,688 young American men.
A huge force.
When the battle was over, after weeks of horrific, close-quarters combat, only 177 of those men walked off the island alive. The casualty rate is almost incomprehensible. Amidst that carnage, there is the story of Jacqueline Lucas, a Marine who was only 17 years old.
Just a kid.
Right. During a firefight in a trench, 2 enemy grenades landed right next to him and his squad mates. Without hesitating, this 17-year-old boy threw his own body directly onto both live grenades and pulled them under his chest. He absorbed the full force of the blast to save the lives of his friends. Miraculously, he survived, though he endured dozens of surgeries over the rest of his life.
It is a breathtaking display of raw courage, and it raises a fierce theological challenge for the modern Christian. If earthly citizens, young men with their whole lives ahead of them, can display such blood-soaked devotion and willingness to die for a temporary geopolitical victory, how much more should Christians risk for an everlasting kingdom?
It is convicting.
We serve the Lord of glory, a king who has already defeated death and secured our eternal future. We have an inheritance that cannot rust, rot, or be stolen.
Yet we complain if the Sunday church service goes 10 minutes past the hour. We complain if the music's too loud, or if we are asked to give financially beyond our comfortable surplus. We guard our weekends fiercely, and we treat any disruption to our comfort as an intolerable offense. We have no concept of wartime sacrifice.
The contrast is a massive indictment of our culture. We must repent of our idolization of safety. We must turn off the screens that are numbing our minds. The text calls us to reclaim the night watches.
Reclaim the night watches. I like that.
Instead of spending the final hours of the evening mindlessly scrolling through social media or watching television, we need to reclaim that time for meditation on Scripture, for fervent prayer, and for reading theological works that stir our affections for Christ. We must use our resources, our money, and our homes not to build a heavily insured fortress of isolation for our nuclear family, but to relieve the poor, support foreign missions, and advance the gospel in our local communities. We are called to operate with a wartime lifestyle.
Let's summarize the massive progression of ideas we have tracked today. We started in the brutal, suffocating heat of the Judean desert, witnessing King David's intense physical thirst being entirely eclipsed by his thirst for God's covenant loyalty.
A radical reordering of desires.
We moved forward to the dusty roads of Galilee, where Jesus prohibited his economically vulnerable followers from succumbing to pagan panic, commanding a radical reliance on the Father's provision. We saw the Apostle Paul violently reject his own self-righteousness, tossing his elite social and religious status into the street as toxic refused to gain Christ.
Right into the trash.
And we saw all of this culminate in the finished work of Jesus on the cross. Jesus entered the ultimate wasteland, bore the wrath of God, and secured our eternal lives, thereby freeing us to risk our temporary ones without fear.
The trajectory through all these texts is very clear. The unwasted life is not the famous life. It is not the easy life, the wealthy life, or the heavily insured life. The unwasted life is the one that proves, through its radical spending, its willingness to endure suffering, and its calculated risks for the gospel, that Christ surpasses all earthly gain.
Which leaves us with one final piercing thought for you to mull over on your own as you go about your week. Imagine for a moment that an outside, completely objective auditor was given unrestricted access to your life.
An uncomfortable thought.
Extremely. This auditor does not care what songs you sing on Sunday morning. They do not care about the theological books on your shelf or the bumper sticker on your car. They only look at the hard, undeniable data, your bank statements from the last 12 months and your weekly calendar showing exactly where every single hour of your time went.
Just the math.
Based solely on the mathematics of that ledger, who would they conclude is the supreme treasure of your life? Does your ledger show that you are frantically building a kingdom of personal comfort that is destined to rust and decay? Or does it declare, loud and clear, that God's loving kindness is better than breath itself?
That is the audit every single soul must eventually face.
Remember the biological flinch we talked about at the very beginning? The hardwired reflex to protect your hand from the hot stove? The texts we examined today are asking you to recognize that instinct for self-preservation and then, empowered by the grace of God, to override it. They are calling you to reach your hand into the fire of a sacrificial life, knowing with absolute certainty that the one who holds you is infinitely better than the life you might lose. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep reading, and we see you next time.